Okay, so I wanted to make a quick video. This will be part of a longer series. The common question I get asked, specifically related to cloud, is how do you threat model, right? Threat modeling in the cloud. And I first want to take a step back to define threat modeling, right? As we know it, you likely have heard of Stride, Dread, right? Pasta, right? Not the pasta you like, right? It's some areas of a good practice to kind of follow. There is a lot around threat mapping, specifically related to cloud. Due to the inherent nature of these disconnected services, right, there's still a lot of what I call misunderstandings of, okay, where are those controls? What are the ways that they can be, manipulated when you're thinking of red teaming or in general, hey, I want to adopt cloud services. I want to ensure my organization is well prepared, right, to get the most out of this type of service, right? So I'm gonna, go through some protections for a service, right, just as an example of how I would start that conversation, but then also break down, some of the nuances related to how we look at threats in cloud. So I do have a couple resources. If you see that, I'll go through here. These are more for great reference. Now, this is the Center for Threat Informed Defense, the Mitre Ingenuity. It's essentially control mappings related for specific clouds. Now, this one is a little bit older. If I think I view it on GitHub, and I can put some of these links inside the chat. But this is pretty substantial in the amount of impact that it has, right? It was released June 29, 2021. You'll see that a couple of them are obviously related, a little bit newer. They have their own, and then Google Cloud Platform. And these are really respected across the industry because this gives you a high-level summary. It's open source, but also if I'm going to deploy certain types of resources as they are related in cloud, right, you can see specific areas that you want to consider, and then it categorizes it, it puts it in the threat techniques, so it has a technique related to it. Now, let's say I want to get some more understanding. So for example, confidential VMs and compute engines, right, perhaps I want some more information on this specific technique, right? Main memory encryption is performed using dedicated hardware within the memory controllers. Each controller includes a high performance advanced encryption standard, right? Um, so you want to ensure that the runtime data manipulation, essentially the underlying runtime, is not impacted by any type of manipulation. So if we click further, right, then we'll get redirected to the attack MITRE techniques. Hopefully this is not the first time you're seeing this. If it is, no worries. You're in the right place, okay? Please keep paying attention here. So what this does is essentially show specifically the reference point, but also procedure examples, real world examples, right? Advanced persistent threats, and then you have mitigations related to that, and then the areas that we can detect that. So you want to think of every resource leveraging some form of this, but also you want to map what are the protections that I put in place for a specific service, how can those be manipulated and exploited, and then start modeling the controls, whether that's infrastructure as code, right, for your Terraform people out there, Bicep, CloudFormation, etc., right? How can I ensure that I'm putting the right parameters, configurations to deploy what I call securely in the beginning? So I'm going to start with a common use case that I typically see, and that's blob storage. So blob storage, it's fairly familiar to everyone that is using cloud services, right? And I'll show you some of these preventions here. So a key metric here, let me go back. I thought I had that up. Let me double check. Let me go back here. So for the attack Navigator that you'll see here. So I can essentially view this in a more visual format. As you can see here, this allows you to deselect. It's an interactive. I can add a layer, right? I can add a new tab. I can start at the enterprise, or I can say mobile, right? It's likely you probably are going to be dealing with enterprise, but perhaps you're using ICS and other mechanisms there, right? Now I can obviously add specific matrix configurations. I can look at aggregate scores, and you want to use this as you're mapping those threats, right? So I can change the colors, right, as well, for the background. So you can get pretty granular with this, and then you can look at the layer information, right? I'm looking at specific data. I can add metadata. I can add links. Essentially make it your own, right? Now, this is not the full, capabilities of this, but just to show you an example how these are kind of configured. So OS credential dumping, right? And then any sub-process related to that. So you see a 0 of 8, and then all the types of techniques, right? And then let's say I want some more information on that specifically, but how are we going to protect that? So this would be looking at Kubernetes as well, right? If someone's accessing that from the underlying storage perspective, those are some things to consider, right? Now, going back, so I stay on task here. So for every service that Microsoft deploys, right, and or that you deploy through Microsoft, right, there is specific best practices aligned to that service. So what you're seeing here is just a list of what is known as native controls. You have a soft delete, which is essentially a mechanism to ensure that the storage account itself, if it were to be deleted without some type of resource lock, right, that goes back to governance, it stays in a purgatory state. Now we also have the limit network access, right? We already pretty well versed in cloud that you shouldn't have storage accounts that are enumerated from the public web, right? Unless that's your actual intention and it's segmented and locked down for the use case itself. Shared access signatures, or SAS tokens as they're called, right? I'm not really the biggest fan of this. There's just been a lot of leaks with this enablement. But there is use cases for people to still use them, so they are still available. You can disable this at creation, right? I will show you what that looks like. And then managed identities is a best practice to use for some of the access and blobs. Now I'm going to show you how this looks in the console as well, but also consider what are the mechanisms that if this were exploited, then what, right? So as a prime example, most of the time when we're looking at versioning, right, what is the impact? When we think of the impact of not doing this, we have perhaps data modification, right, just as an example. And I'm just using this as an example. Data deletion, right, massively. And this could be sensitive data, right? Let's say this is holding PCI, DSS data, regardless PHI, PII, whatever the case may be. So this is a control that we should have in place as far as versioning and have immutable blocks. So it's write once, read many, right? But then also have the controls in place to monitor that. Now, if that were modified or something were to bypass that area, what are the protections that we do have around that? And that's going to get into some of the file integrity monitoring, right? If that is not configured, because this will disallow that, right? Now, for other use cases, in general, you want to have a regular cadence of any account keys or API tokens that are rotated. You want to do this programmatically. This is called out in the Cloud Control Matrix from the Cloud Security Alliance as well, right? If you're unfamiliar, I can definitely share those comments in the chat. But again, what are these areas that can be manipulated? Now, you probably have heard about massive leaks inside Microsoft Azure, right? I'm not going to say that those don't occur, or exploitation does not occur to just one cloud, AWS or Azure for that. So SAS tokens are essentially the equivalent of pre-signed keys in AWS, right? So you likely have heard of pre-signed keys or pre-signed URLs, right, where it's essentially a unique URL that gives you access to the underlying storage account. Now, the problem with SAS tokens is that this account, it can be widely open in the sense of if this token is essentially retrieved from a bad person, entity, etc., you want to think about what are the mechanisms to A, detect the access, but also B, if we have to revoke access, right? Is there policies in place for that? If so, how are they, monitored, things like that, indicators. So those are really where I kind of start. I look at, okay, what are the native controls to the platform itself? What do we have, whether that's third party or first party, right, required? But do we understand the implications for each enablement? But then also, how can that be attacked? And a good way to visualize this is, I don't know if you've heard of Decidius. I believe it's decidius.app. Let me just run a quick search. Decidius. Okay, I probably spelled that wrong. So this is a example attack tree. Now, similar to the threat modeling, right, an attack tree is showing you all the ways that anyone can access essentially the goal is to access video recordings in S3 bucket, right? So this has a little fun way of attackers win. And then this has a easier way to manipulate this visual with YAML, right? So pretty similar. You can change this as much as you want, and I'll put this chat as well. This is fully open source. But as you can see, right, this goes into a specific storage account that would have some material related to a video, and then all the ways that can be manipulated, right? You want to explore the ways that those can be manipulated, right? And this even goes into third-party library checking, vuln scanning by 0-day, exploit the vulnerabilities, right? 0 days in AWS multi-tenant access, use single tenant AWS HSM, right, etc. So this can get pretty, what's the word, in the weeds, if you will. Now, I'm a visual person, so I typically will map or use this application that you see here to map, okay, what are we doing today, but also what are those protections in place moving forward. So if you see here, this will show you, okay, here's that control, and then the limit network access, right? So, and I'm going to show you what this is inside the console as well, right? Now, these are general best practice, but these are not going to entail every, again, you can map out every component to what you believe will occur, right? That's essentially the threat model. And then we build detections around that, but then also preventative measures to stop that. Now, realistically, I think this is the best way to A, get the most out of your security solutions, whether that's in Microsoft or someone else, but B, have a thorough understanding of your architecture inside the cloud and beyond that as well. It's generally a good practice to break these down in components, similar to if we were building a program, a CLI tool, things like that, right? Those are going to be the areas to consider. So I'm going to switch over to the console, and if we see here, we can see that I have a couple of items here. So I have our Blob service that we talked about, right? Now you want to think about Blob storage, at least in the Azure perspective, right? It has a couple of nuances. It's straightforward and it's Azure storage account instead of S3 buckets, right? You'll All right, I had to throw that in there. But anyways, so on our left-hand side, we have our containers, file shares, queues, tables, and then we have our security portion, right? So you'll see Defender for call integrity monitoring, and then on-upload malware scanning, right? So threat detection as well. Now again, that's not to say you're not doing that outside of that. That's just showing you what's native. So let's go into the configuration items here. So if I go into settings, I can start breaking down. Let me go back to configuration, let that load. So a couple items that we can configure through our configurations. We can prevent those storage or shared access signature SAS tokens, plainly speaking, which I think is a good practice, but however, that might go against some areas that you might need for, right? Now you can see secure transfer required. So this is forcing HTTPS encryption, basically. So there won't be no ability to call a REST API to upload to said storage account. Now you can see here, allow storage account keys. I have this enabled, but a best practice is to disable that, right? Now, if we look at the next area here, allow blob anonymous access. This should be disabled outright. I need a audit trail, right? Plainly speaking, and this kind of goes back to AWS public buckets, right? If it's set to public, essentially you're opening a way out, open without no trail, right? For anonymous reads, essentially. So that's how you want to think about that, if that's disabled outright. Now, allow recommendation upper limit for shared access key. This essentially, if you highlight over, if it exceeds a certain recommended interval, that usage is logged. This is more of a preventative measure, but I look at this as detective in that realm. Now, minimum TLS version, you should be running 1.2. I know recently we talked about 1.3 being pushed out. And then your blob tier, right? So this is going to go into that financial operations. You can do hot or cold. And then if I had large file shares or I was going to enable this said storage account for those file shares, this will tell you what that is, right? We can support up to 100 terabytes. Now, as you can see, as far as performance, this is going to be standard and then premium. And then if I go back to areas where it shows encryption, I can go even further on encryption. Perhaps I don't want to use Microsoft's managed keys, right? Perhaps I have requirements to bring my own encryption key. That would be here. And then I also have encryption scopes as well, right? So I can map out a specific scope and then put that nomenclature inside there, enable that as well. Now the shared access signatures, I'm going to cover this because this is one of those areas that you'll always see specifically with red teaming, right? So this is essentially opening up your pre-signed URL, right, for those in AWS. Now I can specify if I'm looking at a service, a container, an object, and then what are the allowed permissions, what are the allowed services, and then the blob index permissions here. Now you can see by default, right, if I hit start, this gives it a expiration day within the next day, right? Or well, no, this starts today, and then this would expire tomorrow at 2 a.m. So you want to keep this, if you do use this, very limited, right? And just the lowest level permissions needed for that, right? Preferably, when I think of write, anything that can be deviated, delete, right? So you can limit this, as you can see, and then this will generate a SAS connection monitor. Essentially, that key with the URL will allow it access, and then you can see you have your keys here. Additionally, this is going to be one of the key areas that hopefully if you're using with a defined duration, but also a very limited duration. Now you can go even further to have specific IP addresses mapped to that, like a local, and then you can even define what protocols, ideally HTTPS, right, as one of those key areas. Now if I go to networking, I can look at what that network looks like, right? So enable from all networks. Never would I suggest this, right? This is for demonstration purposes. The front door, CDN, those are also going to be highlighted here. Now, going back to where does this all play in the big picture? I would start, in general, from a threat model that makes sense to you, right? Preferably something as drawn out as this for a resource, and then start building back. Now, I'm going to go through this with Kubernetes. I'm going to go through this with AI models, machine learning, and how that kind of leads into what is capable natively and then what would likely be external, right? So just at a high level, I wanted to start the conversation on where we're going, but also show you some resources along with context so you understand kind of what the motion is moving forward with this type of series related to threat modeling in the cloud. Hopefully you found this helpful. Thanks for your time.